When I walked into this Nebraska bank carrying my grandfather's old leather ledger, the manager barely looked up. He thought it was just another dusty family keepsake. He had no idea this old book was about to change everything. My grandfather, Earl Whitfield, spent his entire life writing down every agreement, every promise, and every important detail. Most people thought he was simply too careful. They couldn't have been more wrong. He stopped talking, stared at the pages, and quietly asked me one question. "Where did you get this?"
The bell above the door rang, and the manager barely looked up. An old woman shuffled in, clutching a cracked leather ledger against her chest like it was something precious. He smirked. He'd seen this 100 times. Grandkids showing up with dusty old junk, hoping for a miracle. "Ma'am, I really don't think," he started, reaching for the book just to humor her. Then he opened it. His smile disappeared. His hand froze mid-page, because what was written inside wasn't sentimental at all. It was something this bank had spent 60 years trying to bury. "And before you go, where are you watching from? Drop your city below." The manager's smile didn't fade slowly. It dropped like a stone. 1 second he was indulging an old woman out of politeness. The next, his eyes were locked on a page filled with handwriting so precise it almost looked typed. He turned to the next page, then the next. His jaw tightened. "Where did you get this?" he asked, quieter now. "My grandfather," the woman said simply. "Earl Whitfield. He kept records his whole life. Everyone thought he was just odd about it. To understand why that ledger mattered, you have to go back. Not years, decades. Back to 1961, to a small farmhouse 15 miles outside town, where a young Earl Whitfield sat at his kitchen table every single night with a fountain pen and a stack of blank notebooks. His wife used to tease him about it. His neighbors thought it was strange. Farmers talked about weather, crops, cattle prices, not paperwork. But Earl wasn't like other farmers. He'd grown up watching his own father lose half his land in a handshake deal that everyone remembered differently once the ink dried and the lawyers got involved. Earl swore that would never happen to him. So he wrote everything down, every agreement, every loan, every water rights conversation with the county, every promise the bank ever made him, word for word, date for date, signature for signature. People called it obsessive. His own son once told him, "Dad, nobody's going to care about a farmer's notebook in 50 years. Earl just smiled and kept writing. In 1968, the bank, the very same one this granddaughter was standing in now, approached Earl with what they called a generous opportunity. A new dam project was coming through, and the county needed access to a strip of land that ran along Earl's northern property line for irrigation and water rights. The bank, acting as the go-between for the county, presented Earl with paperwork to sign. They told him it was a temporary access agreement. The land would stay in his family. They just needed rights to manage water flow through it for the dam project. Earl read every line. He always did. Then he did something the bank didn't expect. He asked for a private meeting to add specific terms directly to the agreement, in his own handwriting, initialed and dated, right there at the table. The bank officer at the time, eager to close the deal, agreed and signed off on it without much thought. It seemed harmless, just an old farmer being cautious. What Earl added, in careful looping cursive, was this: the water rights were a lease, not a transfer. The land remained fully his. And if the dam project was ever decommissioned, expanded, or sold to a private entity, the rights would automatically revert back to his family, no renegotiation required. Nobody thought much of those extra lines at the time. The dam was built. Years passed. Earl farmed his land until the day he died in 1994, still keeping his ledgers, still writing everything down, right up to the final entry, a single line about a new fence post order, dated 3 days before his heart gave out. His granddaughter, the woman standing in front of this very confused bank manager, hadn't thought about the ledgers in years. They sat in a box in her attic after her father passed, untouched, until she found them while clearing out the house to sell it. She almost donated the whole box to a local historical society without opening it. But something made her flip through one notebook first. And there, halfway through, she found Earl's copy of that 1968 agreement, the one with his handwritten clauses, signed by a bank officer, whose name she didn't recognize, but whose signature matched records she'd later find still on file. She didn't fully understand what she was looking at yet, but she understood enough to bring it here, today, to the same bank that had once dismissed her grandfather as just an old farmer being cautious. Now, standing across the counter, the manager wasn't smirking anymore. He was doing math in his head, fast, because 3 years ago, this same water access strip had quietly been sold. Not for a public project, not for the county. It had been sold to a private energy company for a substantial sum, and the bank had handled the transaction as an intermediary, collecting a hefty fee in the process. If Earl's clause was real, if it held up, that land, and everything tied to it, may never have legally belonged to the county or the energy company at all. The manager set the ledger down slowly, like it might bite him. "I need to make a call," he said. "Please, take a seat." He walked to his office, closed the door most of the way, but not all the way, and picked up the phone. His voice, usually smooth and rehearsed, came out tight and fast. "You need to come down here, now, bring the 68 file, all of it." The granddaughter sat in the waiting area, hands folded over the box that held the rest of Earl's ledgers, 12 notebooks in total, each one a year, sometimes 2, of a man's entire financial and legal life, documented in a way most institutions stopped bothering to do decades ago. Through the half-closed office door, she could hear fragments. Original signature. "No, I'm telling you, it's dated. I don't know how nobody caught this in the audit." She hadn't come here expecting any of this. She'd come, honestly, mostly out of curiosity, and maybe a small hope that the ledger might explain some old family land boundary confusion that had come up while she was settling her father's estate. She had no idea she was about to unravel something the bank itself didn't fully understand it had been sitting on. If you're just joining here, quick pause, hit subscribe now, because what happens in the next few minutes is the actual turning point of this story, and you don't want to miss how this unfolds. Alright, back to it. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The bank manager reappeared, and this time he wasn't alone. A woman in a gray blazer walked beside him, carrying a thick manila folder marked with a case number instead of a name. She introduced herself as the bank's regional compliance officer. "Mrs. Whitfield Carr," she said, using the granddaughter's married name, which caught her slightly off guard. They'd clearly already looked up her identity while she waited. "We'd like to take a closer look at the documents you brought in, if you're willing." She was willing. That's exactly why she'd come. They moved to a private conference room. The compliance officer laid out the bank's copy of the 1968 agreement beside Earl's copy. Side by side, the core contract language matched almost word for word, except for one section. The bank's official file was missing the handwritten addendum entirely. No mention of the lease-only terms, no mention of the reversion clause, just a clean, simple transfer of water access rights, as if Earl had signed away the land outright with no conditions at all. This doesn't match our records," the compliance officer said carefully, flipping between the two documents. "No," the granddaughter agreed, "but it matches what my grandfather signed. He always kept a copy of everything he agreed to. He didn't trust handshake deals, he'd learned that the hard way from his own father." The compliance officer's expression shifted from professional detachment to something more careful, more concerned. She excused herself again, taking both documents to photograph. While she was gone, the granddaughter finally asked the bank manager the question that had been sitting in her chest since she walked through the door. "Is this going to matter? Or is this just an old piece of paper nobody cares about anymore?" The manager hesitated. He wasn't supposed to say much. She could tell that from the careful way he chose his words. But something about the moment, or maybe some old-fashioned decency underneath the suit and title, made him answer honestly. "M.A.A.M. If what you're showing us is authentic, and it looks authentic, this isn't just paperwork. That water access strip was sold 3 years ago to a private company for land the bank's own file says it had full rights to sell." The room went quiet. The granddaughter thought about her grandfather at that kitchen table, night after night, writing by lamplight, while everyone around him assumed he was wasting his time. She thought about her father, who used to roll his eyes at the old ledgers and almost threw them out twice. She thought about how close this entire truth had come to disappearing into a landfill along with the rest of an estate sale. "He always said, paper remembers what people forget," she said quietly, almost to herself. The compliance officer returned, along with someone new, a man in a suit who introduced himself only as legal counsel for the regional office. He didn't sit right away. He stood at the head of the table, looking at both documents one more time, then finally looked up. "We're going to need copies of everything in that box," he said, nodding toward the pile of ledgers still sitting untouched. All of it. And Mrs. Whitfield Carr, I'd strongly recommend you have your own legal representation present for any further conversations. That single sentence changed everything. Because banks don't say that unless they already know they're in trouble. For the first time since she'd walked in that morning, the granddaughter allowed herself a small, quiet breath of something like vindication. Not triumph yet. It was too early for that. But something had shifted in that room, and everyone at the table knew it. 3 weeks passed before the granddaughter heard anything official. In that time, she'd hired an attorney her cousin recommended, a woman who specialized in property and land disputes, and who, upon hearing the story, actually laughed out loud in disbelief before immediately asking to see the ledgers herself. What the attorney found, after cross-referencing Earl's handwritten notes with county records, historical land surveys, and the bank's own archived microfiche files, was more significant than anyone in that first meeting had realized. Earl's 1968 addendum wasn't just a minor clause, it was airtight. He had specifically written that the water access rights were granted for the exclusive and sole purpose of the county dam and irrigation project, said rights to automatically and immediately revert to the Whitfield family or their legal heirs should the land, in whole or part, ever be sold, leased, or transferred to any private entity, individual, or corporation not directly affiliated with the original Public Works Agreement. He'd even had it signed and dated by a bank witness, and, critically, he'd had a copy officially stamped and filed with the county clerk's office, not just kept privately. That last detail was the peak of the entire story, because it meant Earl hadn't just quietly protected himself with a personal notebook entry. He had made sure that somewhere, in a dusty public records office, an official government copy existed too, one that nobody had thought to check in 50-plus years, because nobody was looking for it. Everyone assumed the bank's internal file was the full and complete record. Nobody imagined a Nebraska farmer had been careful enough and cynical enough about institutions to double protect himself in a way that would outlive him by decades. When the energy company purchased that water access strip 3 years earlier, they had done so believing, accurately, based on the bank's records, that they were acquiring full, unrestricted rights. The bank had profited from facilitating that sale. But legally, according to a document filed in the public record since 1968, none of it should have happened without the Whitfield family's involvement, consent, or compensation at all. This wasn't a sentimental family story anymore. This was a real, provable, legally documented error, or, depending on how you looked at it, a real, provable case of a family's rights being quietly erased from a bank's internal paperwork at some point over 5 decades, whether by mistake, negligence, or something less innocent. The attorney requested a formal meeting with the bank's legal department and the energy company's counsel. The granddaughter almost didn't go. She said later, it felt surreal, like she was about to sit in a room and argue with grown men in suits about a decision her grandfather made when her own father was still a teenager. But she went, and she brought the ledgers. All 12 of them, plus the certified county copy her attorney had pulled just days before the meeting. She didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. She simply set the documents on the table, the same way her grandfather might have, calm, unhurried, certain of what was written, and unwilling to argue about facts that weren't up for debate. The bank's legal team spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing everything in near silence. At one point, one of the younger attorneys on their side leaned toward a colleague and quietly said, "This is actually valid. This is a real filed document." He wasn't being dramatic. He sounded almost impressed. By the end of that meeting, nobody was arguing about whether Earl's addendum was legitimate. The only question left on the table was what it would cost to resolve. This is the heart of the whole story. Not the money, not even the legal victory, but the quiet, decades-long patience of one man who refused to trust institutions blindly, who took the time, night after night, to write down every detail everyone else considered unnecessary, simply because he'd learned once, the hard way, what happens when you don't. Earl Whitfield never lived to see this moment. He never knew his ledgers would matter this much. This many years later, he just believed, stubbornly and quietly, that paper remembers what people forget, and he made sure that if anyone ever tried to rewrite the story of his land, the truth would already be sitting in a folder, waiting. The settlement took another 4 months to finalize, and true to how these things usually go, most of the specific terms were kept confidential, but enough became public, through county filings and a small piece in the local paper, for the broader picture to come together. The bank issued a formal correction to its records, acknowledging the 1968 addendum as legally binding. The energy company, whose original purchase had been made in good faith, based on inaccurate bank documentation, restructured its water access agreement to include the Whitfield family as rightful stakeholders going forward, along with retroactive compensation for the years the land had already been in use under the incorrect terms. It wasn't a headline-making fortune, but it was significant, enough to pay off the remaining mortgage on the granddaughter's own home, enough to set aside savings for her children's education, and enough, symbolically, to finally close a chapter that had technically been open and unresolved since 1968 without anyone realizing it. But something else happened during those 4 months that mattered just as much as the money. The local paper's small story caught the attention of a county historian, who reached out to the granddaughter asking if she'd be willing to donate copies of Earl's ledgers, not the originals, just copies, to the county archive. Not because of the legal case, but because of what the notebooks represented, an ordinary farmer's meticulous, decades-long record of a rural community's agreements, disputes, weather patterns, prices, and daily life, written in real time by someone who lived it. She agreed, and in doing so, Earl Whitfield, a man his own son once gently mocked for wasting evenings on a farmer's notebook nobody will care about in 50 years, became, quietly, an accidental historical resource for an entire county's understanding of its own agricultural and legal history. The granddaughter kept the originals, of course. She had them professionally preserved, each fragile page protected, and she started, almost without meaning to, doing what her grandfather had done. She began keeping her own records. Property documents, family agreements, even small things like receipts for major purchases and copies of every important letter she received. Not out of paranoia, she'd say later, but out of respect, because she finally understood something her grandfather had known his whole life. Institutions forget, people misremember, and paperwork gets lost more often than anyone likes to admit. But a written record, dated and signed, doesn't change its story depending on who benefits from a different version. She thought often, in those months, about how close this all came to never happening. If she'd donated that box unopened to the Historical Society. If she'd trusted her first instinct that the notebooks were just sentimental clutter. If her father, years earlier, had actually followed through on tossing them out during one of his periodic garage cleanouts, as he'd threatened to more than once. An entire piece of her family's history, and a legitimate legal claim worth real money and real justice, had survived purely because one stubborn old farmer refused to stop writing, and one granddaughter happened to flip through a single notebook before deciding its fate. The bank manager who'd first opened that ledger, the same one who'd smirked before his face went pale, later told a colleague, in a story that eventually made its way back to the granddaughter secondhand, that it was the single most humbling moment of his career. Not because he'd done anything wrong personally, he hadn't. He was simply the person standing at the counter when 56 years of quiet, careful documentation finally caught up with an error nobody living had made, but everyone had inherited. Earl Whitfield never got to see any of this. He died believing, at most, that his notebooks might someday help settle a boundary dispute or clarify an old family disagreement. Practical, small-scale insurance against the kind of institutional forgetfulness he'd witnessed his own father suffer through. He never imagined a dam, an energy company, and a bank's internal filing error decades in the future. He just knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who trusted paper more than promises, that someday, somehow, the truth in those pages might matter. And it did. 56 years later, in a small Nebraska bank, it finally did. The granddaughter closed the last ledger and placed it gently back into its box, the same way her grandfather once closed his notebook each night before turning off the lamp. She didn't feel triumphant, exactly, just quietly proud, and grateful that one stubborn man's patience had outlasted every institution that once dismissed him. If this story reminded you that ordinary people, quiet diligence, and a little paperwork can outlast even the biggest institutions, that's exactly the kind of story we tell here every week. Subscribe now, and tell us below. Do you have an old family record that might be hiding something worth remembering?